Hey, good morning, options traders. Well, here's a good question that's been floating around the markets a lot about GameStop. How can you possibly short 226% of the float? How is that possible? Well, if you understand the mechanics of shorting and of naked short selling, you'll see that it's actually quite possible. So to see how it's possible, let's do a quick review of a short sale. Remember that short sales are used when traders believe a stock's value will fall. It's a bearish position. And the way that you do this is that you sell shares you don't own. And you're probably thinking, how can you possibly sell something you don't own? Well, it's actually pretty easy. You borrow the shares from the broker. Now that might even sound like a complicated process, but every broker in the world is set up to do this. It's no different than if you swipe a credit card and have to borrow money from your credit card. That's what they're set up to do. It's part of their functioning. They're all set up to be able to lend out shares for sale in the market. So let's say that we borrow these shares from the broker and we sell them in the open market for the current market price of $100. And once you do that, you have an obligation to buy those shares back to return them. But there is no time limit. Now, yeah, there's some other side issues if you happen to fall into a maintenance call and can't cover it, that they might buy those shares back. But outside of any margin issues, there's not really any defined time limits. So let's say that at a later date, we buy these shares back for $95. Well, if you sell at 100, buy for 95, that is a $5 gain. So notice that in this case, we sold the shares for 100, we bought them back for 95. But isn't that the same thing as if we had purchased them at 95 and sold at 100? You see, short sellers are doing exactly the same thing that investors are doing. They're just doing it in the reverse order. But the whole key to understand for this presentation is that before the broker can lend you these shares, the broker must do what's called a locate. The broker physically has to locate shares from another trader. So the trader might say, okay, I can see that Sam Smith over here has 100 shares of this stock in his account. And once they've been located, we can say that this short sale is being attached, so to speak, to those shares. And it's because of this that people say, well, how is it possible that we can end up with more shares short than are in the market? Well, there's a couple of terms we have to cover. First one is about the float. And every company has a fixed number of shares in the market. Now, of course, they can go out and issue more shares, but at any given point in time, there's a fixed number of shares that are in the market. First, they have what's called the shares outstanding. And these are the total authorized shares for sale. But then there's what's called the float. And these are the shares that are currently in the market. So the reason for the difference here is that a company might have 100 million shares authorized, but they say, we don't really want to sell them all right now. We want to sell 80 million. Or maybe they've purchased some back and are holding it as treasury stock. So just because there are a certain number of shares outstanding doesn't mean that's necessarily what's out there in the market. And so because of this, the float is generally less than 100% of the shares outstanding, but not always. So for example, if we go to finance.yahoo.com and type in GME for our ticker here, we've got a lot of different things that we can look at on Yahoo. It's really a nice site, especially for free. But if you click on statistics, down below, right here are the share statistics. And right there, shares outstanding 69.75, almost 70 million. But look at the float. Just about 47 million, significantly less than the shares outstanding. But take a look down here. Short percent of the float as of January 15th, 2021, 226.42%. So how can you possibly have 226% of the float being short? Doesn't the broker have to locate these shares? How is it possible to exceed 100%? Well, it's a good question, and there are a couple of key reasons. The first one is that shares can get lent multiple times. So this whole process of shorting can get repeated over and over. So that's the first reason. The second one is because of a thing called naked short selling. So let's take a look at the first one, how shares can get lent multiple times. Let's say that this is your account here. You've got 100 shares. Let's call it Microsoft. You've got it fully paid for, sitting there, you own the shares, no problems at all. But another trader decides that he wants to short shares of Microsoft, so the broker has to do a locate. And the broker says, yep, I found it right here in investor A's account. So the shares here in black are just the located shares. Those are lent out to trader B. Trader B then shorts those shares in the open market. So your account shows plus 100, but trader B's account shows minus 100. But in order for B to sell these shares or to short these shares, somebody has to buy them. So let's say that trader C buys these 100 shares. Now, of course, as far as C knows, he is absolutely the owner of real shares just like you are. And to some extent, he really is. Because if C decides to sell these shares, that's fine, he can do it. The broker will just have to find it from another person to replace those shares. So here's where it gets tricky though. Let's say that investor C has 100 shares, but another trader wants to short it. Well, this guy's broker locates the shares and he says, okay, yes, I found 100 shares. It's over here in trader C's account. But remember, those aren't really real shares. They were created from a short sale. So investor D says, okay, I'd like to borrow these shares and I'm going to short them. So notice that investors B and D are short 100 shares. So we've got 200 shares short, but they were both generated from the initial 100 shares up here from you. So this process can go on and on. Now it sounds almost a little fishy, but it's really the way that banking systems work. If you deposit $1,000 into a checking account, it doesn't just sit there with your name on it in a little box. The bank loans that money out. And if there's a 10% reserve requirement, that $1,000 deposit will eventually expand to $10,000. So it's kind of strange when you think of all of the money that's out there in circulation. It's probably being created on 1/10 of the actual dollars out there. And so that's really what's happening here with the business of shorting. Because if you buy shares, you don't really know if they were actual shares that were delivered or if you were buying shares to complete a short sale. And that's why you can end up with far more than 100% short. But it gets even more complicated than that. There's another practice called naked short selling. Now, this is not something that you or I could do as retail investors. It's more for the market makers and dealers. But for these groups, they are not required to do this locate. They can just say, yeah, we're good for it. So in 2005, the SEC enacted Regulation SHO to curb some of these abusive practices, where there were groups out there that would just go out there and just short the heck out of stock to create an artificially high number of shares and therefore drive down the price intentionally. So now you can still do naked shorting, still legal, but it's really by a limited group. And so one of those groups is with broker-dealers. So a broker or dealer accepting orders from another broker or dealer does not have to do this locate. And then the second one is for bona fide market making. So it has to be a legitimate market making firm, let's say on the floor of the SIBO. You can't just say, I'm now ABC Inc. market making and therefore I can do it. It has to be a legitimate market making firm. And so it makes sense that if a firm is having to sell shares, that they don't have to always go out there, and if they don't have them on hand, they can just do a naked short sale. But in order to do that, they do have to have a good faith reason for saying, yes, we really thought that we'd be able to locate these. But it's really to help with the efficiency of the markets and to make sure that they can get these shares if people are looking to buy them, that they might need to take these naked short positions. So it's these two practices. It's the fact of just the nature of short selling, and also because of naked short selling, that you can end up with more than 100% of the float being short. And that's what set up the massive short squeeze in GameStop. For anyone who'd like to learn more about the arts and science of options trading, please check out the Alpha Trader course, Strategy Lab, and a brand new technical analysis course. You can find it all at optionsatoz.com. Also, please join us on the Facebook trading group, Options A to Z, and you can find a link in the description below.